Okay, so I decided that one of my goals for this spring break is to watch the entire filmography of David Lynch. Uh, Prior to this undertaking, the only movies of his that I've seen Mulholland Drive a couple times. I've seen Blue Velvet, and both of those were within the last few years. I've also seen Elephant Man and I've seen Dune, but both of those I saw when I was quite a bit younger, and I'd have to say in both cases I don't really remember either one very well. So I had this wacky idea just to, I don't know, keep life interesting, and because we're all quarantined right now and bored, and why not just make some content for the fuck of it, to do some like snap analyses of these movies as I see them. So I just watched Eraserhead for the first time, and the idea of this snap analysis is I did not read up about it. I did not look into a critical opinion or what other analysts or researchers or theorists have said about what the movie's about. I'm just going off seeing it once, talk about my ideas of what I think it was and what I think it was about. Now, one of my founding ideas for this analysis is I have heard David Lynch say in interviews, and already, so I'm quoting an interview, which means that this is not a totally sourceless carte blanche analysis, but I can't help what I already saw before watching the movie. I have heard David Lynch say in interviews that Eraserhead is his most spiritual movie, and so I was watching it with an eye towards a spiritual, or let's say psychological, interpretations. I think the movie is about the fear of a weak person, not a bad person, but just a weak, self-assured person that doesn't have inner conviction about how to approach life. What happens when such a person emerges from an infantile state into the responsibilities of life, and particularly how do they deal with the adult dynamics of sexuality. And maybe this is by nature skewed towards a male perspective, a heteronormative perspective. I don't know. Maybe it's generalizable. I'm not sure. In this case, the person standing in for that, every person, is a man, and I'm also a man doing the analysis and bringing to it my own viewpoints and resonances. So here's what I saw. Throughout the whole movie, you see Eraserhead, which is, his name is Henry, I think, is a very, very ineffectual person, and he's afraid of everything that confronts him. And he never takes any initiative. He's always kind of being buffeted around by what's around him. And the original crisis of the movie is him getting the news that because he slept with this girl Mary, there's a pregnancy, and now there's this baby. So I think the original sexual intercourse is kind of the act of moving from childhood into adulthood, and then the baby is the impinging, the burden of adult responsibilities on Eraserhead. So we immediately see that this baby, this fruit of his perhaps unintentional step into adult life, is this hideous monstrosity. He has no taste for it and doesn't know how to relate to it, although he has a basic kind of reluctant compassion for it. And when Mary leaves and he's made to take care of this thing on his own, he makes an effort because he doesn't really know what else to do. So he doesn't immediately get rid of it or kill it or any of the other options that might be open to him. But it represents a increasing burden and terror, which is the terror of realizing you have to step into the world, which is terrifying. And the first, actually before he even meets the baby, the first manifestation of this terror is him, this ineffectual person, stepping into the very dysfunctional dynamic of Mary's family. He goes over to her house for dinner, and her dad, there's this moment where the dad asks him, well, what do you know? And he says, well, I don't know very much. And then there's this long, 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 awkward silence. And that's his reaction to society, the dysfunction of society, the dysfunction of family life. It's asking him, it's there asking him, what do you know? And he doesn't know, he has no response. So his innocence is already confronted with the mechanics of the world, and he has no ability to respond to it. He's taking care of the baby, and he then has his own family life. Now there's this microcosm, this dysfunctional microcosm of him, Mary there in the bed, in the room, and the baby creature. And eventually Mary leaves. There's two other forces that represent his sexual psychology, which is the woman across the hall and the woman in the radiator. I think the woman in the radiator represents his adolescent fantasy life. You know, she has these cheeks built on, which I take to be kind of like baby fat, and she's doing these cutesy dances and singing, and this is his pre-adult ideal of womanhood. And in the first long sequence with her, you see these kind of worm creatures dropping around her, and they kind of look like sperms, and I think they are sperms, and they represent that this is his kind of masturbatory fantasy. And after the first encounter with her, he wakes up with these hideous worm creatures in the bed, which I think is representation of his shame, or the at the disharmony between his inner infantile sexual fantasy life and fantasy woman, and then the real woman and the real family life that he has stumbled into there. And he's picking these things out of the bed, and he's afraid of them, and he's ashamed of them, and he kind of throws them against the wall, and he turns his back on them. And then he has another experience of shame and humiliation on the other side of the pendulum swing, which is he encounters the woman across the hall, who's strong, sexy, self-possessed. This is like him encountering, the one is the woman that is too safe and doesn't represent reality. The other is the reality of the self-possessed woman who doesn't need him, and in the face of whom he has no strength and nothing to offer. This is like kind of the classic femme fatale is not really the right term, more like the classic strong woman, strong partner, strong other that this weak, infantile man doesn't have the capacity to address or deal with. I think the word I was looking for here was intimidating. A strong woman who's intimidating to a weak man. And he has an encounter with her, and the bed turns into this like hot tub, which is kind of like when you do get with that person who's out of your league, and it's like you're just like, you think you're in heaven, like heroin for a second there. But ultimately, of course, that is also a failed enterprise, and it's right after that that he has the fantasy of retreats back. He goes back to the woman in the radiator immediately after that, and that's where his head pops off. The little worm comes out of his head. And by the way, side note, the little worm in the box that he gets in the mail, I don't know what to make of that. I don't know how that fits into this analysis. I thought it was maybe supposed to be the baby's food, but that didn't end up being what it was, because he found it at the same time that the woman, that Mary was not succeeding in feeding the baby. So I thought maybe that this little worm was going to be like, oh, this is the proper food for the baby, but that's not what it turned out to be. There's also the incident, and this is earlier, I'm sorry, this is out of order. Like I said, this is just a snap analysis. There's also the incident where he goes and tries to take the baby's temperature. To me, that's like a symbol of this person trying to, with their totally inept faculties, do something about the problems of adult life. So he tries to take the baby's temperature because not because he knows any better or thinks or has any reason to believe it's the right thing to do, but it's the only thing he knows how to do. Okay, here's this creature, take its temperature. That's what a responsible person does. And you can see it's kind of this gesture of futility. And in his one and only attempt to actually address the life thing that's there, the responsibility that he has, he fucks it totally up. And it's after he takes the baby's temperature that it gets super sick and gets all the sores all over it and starts looking really, really sickly. So his ineptness has been proved again. So this could be the ineptness of the weak man in the field of life responsibility. You could also read it spiritually. This is the ineptness of pure spirit, which he could represent sort of an innocence, a pure non-material spirit consciousness, also having to act in the realm of life, which it actually is not competent to do. If you ascribe to any of that kind of theory, phenomenology, then the spirit doesn't really belong in the realm of matter. And so the spiritual essence, which is Henry and his innocence, fucks up in trying to relate to material matter and real life. Anyway, fast forwarding back to where we were. After the encounter with the woman across the hall, he retreats back to the woman in the radiator, and he has the fantasy where his head pops off, and that's where the kid finds his head, and he gets taken to the eraser factory, and they drill out a core of his head, and it turns out to just be rubber, and they're using it to make erasers out of. I take that to be his self-realization that his sexual preoccupations are crippling him and they're consuming him, and that's all he's good for. So let me explain why I read it that way. To me, the eraser, it appears right at the beginning, and I think that opening scene, you see this close-up of this kind of textured dome, which I take to be a close-up of an eraser on a pencil. And that opening sequence, which we don't know yet what's happening, I read in retrospect to be a symbolic representation of his first sex act with Mary. And the eraser is kind of like the head of a dick and the end of a pencil. And so it turns out his whole head, his whole awareness is made out of phallus material, glands material, which is being stuck on all these pencils. And he discovers about himself that he has no other substance besides his sexual preoccupation. And again, we find this to be a fantasy. He wakes up in bed, and I think, it's funny because I only watched it once, so I also now even the events are not in a clear order, especially because the narrative of the movie isn't in a clear order, so am I even remembering all this correctly? But he wakes up into bed, and Mary's back, I think. No, I think she doesn't come back again after that. Not sure. Anyway, it's revealed to be a fantasy. One more moment I wanted to insert here that I forgot on my first pass through is sometime after that first encounter with the lady across the hall, he does see her one more time, and she's going into her apartment with another guy. He's kind of a gross looking guy, and this is definitely the psychological moment of when that person who's out of your league or who is sexually or romantically intimidating to you, when you witness them move on, and you can see that he's very troubled and hurt and disturbed by this, which is a natural part of the interaction with that person for those of us that encounter that person and or have had them in our life. There's one other character, which is the gnarly looking man pulling the levers, which I take to be fate, or that's maybe if you look into any mythologies where, like ancient Sumerian mythology or something like that, where spiritual beings like ourselves have been entrapped in material matter because of the machinations of the dark counterpart, the dark god, or the Satan figure who has kind of constructed the material world and entrapped us in it. Either way, either as a mythological kind of dark god or as just fate itself, this guy is literally pulling the levers on Eraserhead's life. He is there at the beginning when the baby is conceived, and he makes another appearance in the middle, which I forget exactly where that is, but I remember it reinforce my thesis that that's who he is. And now finally at the end of the movie, after he's gone through this torment and he's realizing that he just fails to relate to life, fails and fails and fails, he does the one act which is open to him, which is to cut off his relationship to life. The only act that's available to Eraserhead is the negative act of, in this case, killing the baby. And you see that when he goes and kills the baby, which is horrifically realized in terms of the visual, and the suffering of the little puppet is just amazingly affecting. At that moment, you see the Fate guy kind of, his gears break and he's grinding the gears, because the one avenue of freedom to Eraserhead, which is to cut off from life, so whether that's a sort of a retreat, a transcendence, a suicide, a spiritual suicide, whatever that moment represents, that's the one thing Fate can't deal with. And existentialism, like I think Camus talked about that being the one really available free act, or maybe it was Sartre. I forget. I'm pretending like I actually read these people. Of course, I've only read about these guys. And then he appears kind of haloed in white. And then the final experience of the movie is the girl in the radiator coming back to him, and in this kind of almost like blinding, whitewashing light, she's back on his in his embrace, and he's kind of retreated back to the safety of his pre-life engagement existence, and then that's when the credits roll. So that is my snap analysis of Eraserhead. I'm sure it's full of flaws, because I'm sure I didn't remember all the details of the movie. I was trying to construct a symbolic interpretation, psychological interpretation of the movie in real time as I watched it, and remember enough to have something to say about it afterwards. So I am sure that that's not perfect, but that's also the point of this. This is a first pass. What did somebody who just took in the movie but made a earnest effort to intellectually come to grips with it take away from it on one viewing? So I hope that was interesting. Maybe it was not at all. Thanks for listening. Bye. There was one other thing I meant to talk about that I just want to mention now. Also stemming from having watched David Lynch in an interview say that Eraserhead was inspired by his experience of moving to Philadelphia in the 70s, when I'm sure it was extremely crime-ridden and a lot of poverty and a lot of dirtiness and all of these things. And he had moved there from an upbringing in Montana. I just wanted to share that I could share that feeling, sense that feeling a little bit. I feel like I had a somewhat of a shared experience abstractly. I'm not saying the same thing as moving to Philadelphia in the 70s. But I had the experience when I first moved to Portland. I lived actually in a nice part of Portland. I'm not saying that I saw the kind of things that he might have seen. But I did move from the woods, the pristine freaking mountains of northern Alaska, to the middle of a pretty big city. And I do remember this kind of feeling of dysphoria that comes from when you have become accustomed to a rural or indeed wilderness setting, the sudden presence of, at nighttime there's sirens, at nighttime there's helicopters flying all the time. I still find helicopters to be an extremely dystopian sound, or loud motorbikes revving down the street with that kind of like roaring demon echo that they do. And when all of those things are suddenly kind of rattling in your consciousness, if you've grown up in a place like Montana or Alaska, there is a definite dread. And there's a parallel, of course, between the moving from Montana into Philadelphia and the moving from innocence into adult life, or the other themes I was talking about in this analysis. So I just wanted to throw in that one more element of it.